Well, before we start, I want to ask who has worked with Oauth before? Good. Who understands how Oauth works internally? Good, that's why you want to attend this talk. Okay, so yeah, now that we start, I want to give like a brief overview of how we interact as developers with authentication or authorization, right? The simplest authentication system that we use is like a username and password, right? We have a website, and then we have a front end or with a login page that the user puts the username or the email and the password, and then it goes and connects to the database, and then the database runs their validation, their check, and if it's fine and everything runs fine, it gives back the session. Usually it's called session tokens. So you receive those tokens, and then the user can access the specific resources associated to that user, right? However, there are common issues when you want to work and then you want to expand that database of users, and then you want to have multiple applications trying to connect to that user database, right? We have security issues in terms of like, I have app number 1, and then I have app number 2. And then each one of them has its own database of users, right? But sometimes, let's say that one user goes and deletes the user account from the app 1, right? Means that we need to run like synchronizations constantly between those databases in order to know that the app 2 that the user left. So it sometimes happens, and it's common in like big organizations. I work in the World Food Program, which means that we have multiple applications, and we shouldn't, and it's not correct to let the application manage their own database of users. The ideal thing is to let the application access the global user database and then retrieve what is needed for that user. That's a security issue. In terms of maintenance, what I was mentioning regarding the synchronization of the databases, or sometimes an employee is relocated to another country and then the database and the accessibility of those resources change, it means that it's going to be like quite complicated to synchronize everything across the whole organization. And then sometimes it's constrained accessibility of information. Sometimes in the organization we have multiple divisions and units. I work in the geospatial unit, and as a geospatial unit, I don't need to know the list of beneficiaries in a country, on a given country. That's another division's concern. However, if you implement the single sign-on on the LDAP authentication, all the users can access all the possible resources that we don't necessarily need. And if it's a security leak or sometimes a hack or attack appears, it's going to be a big problem. So the ideal thing is to limit the users that work on a specific division to access specific resources. The same thing happen in nutrition. So nutrition unit, they don't need to know the warehouses and locations of external UN agencies. They just want to know, like, for example, the caloric tables of food and distribution of them. So there is a protocol, it's called Oauth2, that together with OpenID Connect, they are becoming the best practices to solve the issues that were mentioned before. However, as I asked before, like there's like common confusion in terms of like how that protocol works internally. Usually the terms of like the jargon and the terminology, for example, what is a secret key, how do we use the secret key, what is an exchange code, and so on. And it's hard to find standard information online. The problem is that historically speaking, the protocol was released, but each company or each organization like LinkedIn, Facebook, Google, they have their own implementation of that protocol, and sometimes some terms and some parameters change. So that's why it's quite like complicated to see which one is like the standard one. And yeah, the common problem or what they are looking for is to solve the delegated authorization problem. That means like I'm a user and I want to access some application using the authentication from another application or another platform. So the idea of this talk is like to go through the terminology, the jargon, how does this work internally in order for like you, the attendees, can like give like an overview, like insights of how this works, so you can implement in your applications like easier. Okay, so well, another thing is that everything started with like Yelp. So Yelp was a company, is a company, I think it's in San Francisco. They started in San Francisco, and the idea is that they want to access the list of contacts from your email account. It happened like in 2005, 2006. And the main issue and the main problem is that you as user, you need to put your email address and your password of Gmail. So even they don't say that they store your password of your Gmail account, there could be like an issue of attack, or sometimes you as a user, you don't trust Yelp to give your password because you don't necessarily have the contacts. You can also have your calendar. You can also have your Google Drive. You can also have multiple services attached to your account. That might be like a big problem to give it to Yelp. So, yep. As I mentioned, how does it work means that me as a user, I trust. I'm going to use the example of Google, but you can use it for. You can make the same example for other Microsoft or LinkedIn and so on. So the common phrase is, okay, I trust Google, my account of Google, and I partially trust this app to access my contacts, right? I have an application, I don't know, I have another application that I created, or I'm working in an organization, I want them to access through Google. So as a user, I partially trust this application to access my contacts. From the front end, or as a user, when you will see only a button, right? You will see like a list of buttons like, okay, I want to connect with Google, or I want to connect with Facebook, and so on. But when you press that button, it goes through a process, right? So this is the general like diagram, which means that the user clicks the button, and then it goes and redirects to Google accounts, right? From your application, it goes to the Google servers, and what it visualized comes from Google, not from your application. Then the user puts the username, and they puts the password, and then they see like another view, which that view states, okay, the application wants to access these specific resources, or they want to access your contacts. And then the user clicks consent or approve. And then it goes back, and the application does what it needs to do, and then they can access directly internally the Google contacts. Okay? This is like the general flow of how OAuth works. Okay, a little bit of terminology. So we have a resource owner, which is, in the previous example, my resource owner is Google Contacts. So it's what I want to access, or what I want to get from the application where I, as a user, gave access. Okay? The client ID and the client secret is the one that your application, when you register with Google, they will give you those credentials, and then those credentials are the ones that you put in your app. And those are the ones that are used to perform the flow. The Auth server or identity provider is the ones that host your database of users, or the database that is going to be used for validate that the user that has put the credentials is correct or not. The grant type is the way that you can authenticate, or you can receive those validations. We're going to go through later. And finally, the access token. So the people that have worked before, they have received like the access token, and they just use that access token to access what they need to specifically. So now that we have these terms, it goes like a bit more complicated, which means that when I click the button, it's a request it's a request that is going to be done to Google accounts, to the Google accounts, where you specify what is the redirect URL and what is the response type that you're going to receive. Then the user logs in, they put the username, the password, accepts the consent, and then once everything is fine, they receive something called the exchange code. This exchange code is not the access token, right? This code is going to be used then from your application to connect directly to Google on the backend side, And then you will perform the exchange code to receive the access token. And that's the one that you're going to be using. OK, sorry. Then with the token, you can just get access to Google Contacts. That's the one that matters, right? So using an analogy is usually like the hotel cards. So when you log in, when you check in a hotel, sometimes you receive your cards, right? That card gives you like permissions to access specific areas of the hotel, right? That card gives you, like, for example, you can access the pool or you can access some specific rooms, but you cannot access other people's room. Okay? So that's the analogy. That token is like the card of the hotel. More terms is like the scopes and the consent, which is you can also constrain which specific areas or which specific areas of the hotel the user can access. So when you go to the app, you specify here that you want to get the contacts and the calendar. And then on the consent area, they will say, OK, this application wants to access your contacts and wants to access your calendar area. And once it's fine, you receive that access token, and then you can go through Google Contacts, and also you can get to Google Calendar. But if you make the same request to get to Google Drive, it will fail. It will receive like you are not authorized. So initially, when you register your application in the Google accounts, you need to specify which are the scopes or the possible resources that you want to that the users want to get from you. OK, no more terms from back channel and the front channel. So as I've shared this before, and you see the difference that there are some like lines that are dashed and some lines that are like not dashed. It means that these ones occur on the front channel, on the front end channel, which means that external users can see which are the requests that are made to Google. OK? So when the user clicks here in Facebook, then it goes a request on the front end side if you have a React app or Angular app, and then you click login with Facebook. It's a request that you can see in the network tab, and then it goes through Google with these parameters, then opens the tab or opens the new window, the user logs in, consent, and then the exchange code is received also on the front end. But what happens? When the app receives the exchange code through the endpoint of callback, you need to, the application itself, the protocol states that there needs to be like a direct connection on the backend side if you have a backend server. It needs to go through the backend side when you specify which is the code and then the secret key that you get, and then it will automatically receive the access token. So that's the main difference. So sometimes some things happen on the front end side that users can intercept and can see what's happening, but internally your application needs to go through the Google accounts in order to do the final validation, and then you will receive the token with no issues. Okay. So the workflow, as I mentioned, it could be like resume to like a list of requests, right? So your application makes requests to a server, then it returns something, then you make another request to the server internally or the front end, and then it will receive another type of response, whether it's the access token, whether it's the URL for login. It's a matter of request. So the general workflow is you want to just log in initially, then you specify what is your client ID, the redirect URL, and the scope that you want to access, in this case is contacts, and then you will receive the response type is going to be the exchange code. Why do we need to specify the redirect URL? So what happens is that when you click this button, it will go through Google, and then the user logs in, accepts the consent, but the Google server doesn't know where to go back or where to redirect the response. So we need to specify in the request initially where does Google need to redirect with the exchange core or with the access token. Yes. Okay, the callback. The callback is this area. So this is an endpoint that you need to specify within your API or within your application. And then the callback is going to take the it's going to take the parameters, which is the exchange code that I mentioned, or sometimes could be like an error, like it could be access denied, or that the user, for example, did not accept the consent. So that's the redirection where it goes back. Then you need to specify the callback endpoint. You have your server with your endpoint specified. You receive the parameters, and then you go and perform the exchange. And then it's a final request that is done internally with your server that you pass the code, then you specify the client ID, and then you pass the client secret. So these are the ones that you get when you register your application in the account. And then you receive the access token. So the token usually goes through a header, like an authorization bearer token, and then you go the token. And if you want to get some specific access to the Google Contacts or the Google Calendar, your client, your web app, goes through the API, and then the API is going to check if the token is valid, and it's going to check also the scopes of access. And then if everything is fine, you will receive the resource that you want to get. In this case, it's going to be Google, the contacts of the user. Okay, so there are multiple ways to talk about the Oauth2. What I explained here, this is called the token exchange process, which means that the user goes, makes the login, accepts the consent, receives the exchange code, then internally performs the token exchange with the secret, and then you will receive the access token. However, sometimes you don't have a backend server. Sometimes you have an application which is like a, single page application written in React that doesn't have any backend. Sometimes you have a front-end side, only front-end. However, you can also implement Oauth2, which is a variation of what I mentioned, and it's called implicit one, which means that when you run the flow, instead of receiving here the token exchange, you will receive directly on the front-end side the access token. That's the main difference. The third one is resource owner credentials. Resource owner credentials, which means that your application has already, they can access through the username and password. So, for example, you make your user put the username and password, and then they go directly and they access the resource without the whole flow. So it has its pros and cons, but this is like another variation. The client credentials is that sometimes your applications, they want to access directly the resources, like Google Contacts or Calendar, without requiring the user to log in. It's like that's an agreement that your app needs to have with the identity provider. And once it's done, you can just access the resource without credentials. And okay, so what happens is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's no like a standardized methodology to obtain the user information. So for example, as an identity provider or someone that develops your app, you can design the scopes that you want to access. For example, the contacts and calendar it remains to Google, but for LinkedIn might be another one, or for your application might be another one. There are multiple implementations. As I mentioned, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Google, they have their own way to make those requests that goes to their own servers. And there's no standardized methodology to obtain user information. As I mentioned, with the analogy of the hotel, the card that you receive, they state which are the access or the level of access that you can get or where you can go with to. However, it doesn't have encoded information about you. It means that if you lost that card and someone else picks it, they can access those resources with no problem. So that's a issue found. And because of that, there is like another standard which is built on top of Oauth2, which is called OpenID Connect. Who has worked before with OpenID Connect? Good. So it's like it's a level on top of Oauth2, which means that the OpenID wants to solve the authentication problem. So which means that who is the user that logged in? While Oauth is authorization, which are the level of access that this user with this token they can get. And then the flow is similar. Instead of instead of specifying, okay, sorry, the flow is similar in terms of like the scopes. There is some like predefined scope, which is the OpenID and the profile. And then when the user logs in with and accepts the consent, performs a token exchange, you will receive this, the access token plus another token called the ID token. So that ID token is usually comes in JSON Web in JWT, JSON Web Tokens, and then with that token, it has encoded the user information. You can get the user profile, name, age, ID, depending on how the implementation of OpenID is within the server. And then some examples. So this I usually work with OpenStreetMap. It's a database of geospatial locations. You can get user from information about hospitals, points of interest, and so on, roads. And what happens is that there are many applications that were created, and these applications can access OpenStreetMap as the user database. These apps, they can be different developers accessing the user database. There is no like a single maintainer for all of them. Each one has its own maintainer, but they go through OSM and access. But it doesn't necessarily mean for apps that you're going to build from scratch. In WFP, we have the way we access through a service called RJS, which is from Esri. And Esri has internally implemented the Oauth and the OpenID protocols. So in that way, users from WFP, they can access with their corporate accounts. Okay, and libraries, just to wrap. The Django Oauth is used for Django, which implements already the social, it's called the social logins, which means that you can just specify, okay, I want LinkedIn access, or I want Google access, and so on, and then internally it shows you automatically the button that I was mentioning. Oauth it makes the protocols, implements the protocol, and also it has its identity provider. And this request to Oauth is a wrapper on top of request library that is used for this Oauth2 authorization and authentication. It will you just specify which are the credentials, the client ID, and the client secret, and then it will automatically perform the request with the library. Okay, so thank you. Hope the idea.
So thanks, Jorge. We don't have any question on Slido, but if anyone want to ask a question, okay.
It's more a clarification question. With OpenID Connect, it's like this layer on top. Is this like an extra form of security, or is this a regulation because there's lots of different ways of implementing Oauth2?
Well, usually it's the layer on top means that implements the Oauth2 protocol, the workflow, the exchange code protocol, but they have like defined which are the scopes that you're going to use. Yeah, so you have to specify that you need to send the OpenID and the profile accounts. And when you register your application with Google or Facebook or the identity provider, you need to specify that you want to receive those information about the user. It depends, because sometimes you don't receive in the JWT, you don't receive all the user data. So sometimes you receive just the username and the email, and sometimes you want to get more access. So those identity providers, they have the specific endpoints when you can get more information about the user. For example, in WFP, we can get we make those requests to get which division the user belongs, so we can know and specify the access directly on our application.
Okay, any other question? Okay.
My question is, how does this Oauth2 relate to SAML? It's something I also run into, and I don't understand it either.
Okay, so for example, SAML or it's like a single sign-on workflows, the LDAP. So the implementation the way it's different, sometimes they want to solve. I mean, don't look in a way that you just want to log in with another credentials, right? You don't want to implement your user accounts in your application, and you just want to access with another user database, right? All the three, both Oauth, both SAML, both LDAP, they solve that problem. However, the way the Oauth leverages the other ones is that, for example, you can define the scopes. With the scopes, you can see and you can get access to specific resources that your application doesn't have to or doesn't need to because of security reasons or because of some specific reasons. That's one of the differences. The second one is that the protocol goes through. You don't necessarily need a backend server. For example, you can implement the implicit authentication, so you can receive the token directly. With the SAML and LDAP, you might need a web server that implements that in order to do that. The third one is that I think, I'm not sure yet, but I'm not sure in SAML or DLP you have an expiration of the tokens received, but you can specify which are going to be the expiration, where these tokens are going to expire. And then once it happens, you can just apply with Oauth2 the refresh token flow.
Okay, another question.
OpenID is a protocol implemented by all the most important social networks.
Can you please elaborate more?
Is OpenID a protocol implemented by the most important social network? So the JWT returned from them is different for every social network. So
when you mean different, you mean the data structure?
Yes, the data structure. So the
yes.
profile image, okay.
Yes, okay. So it depends. For example, the Microsoft one, which is the one implemented by so WFP has authentication based on Microsoft, and Microsoft, they have the information that you receive is going to be different than the ones going to be received by Google. So as I mentioned, you can get a username, user email, age, and so on.
Okay, just another question. In the last slide, I've seen 3 libraries.
This one?
No, the last
slide.
Yes, this. What's the difference between if I have a Django application, I have to use all the 3 options, or is
no?
Just
so
one?
Depends on what you want to do with the application. For example, the Oauth, you can just it's a wrapper on top of Django that implements the Oauth, the OpenID and Oauth for each of the social logins that they have. So if you want to get the LinkedIn access with LinkedIn, you can just use the Oauth library, the Django Oauth library, and you specify the client ID and the client secret, and then it will automatically, in your application, in your Django application, it will show you the button. So you don't need to worry internally like which are the requests that I was done, if it's /auth or /token. You don't need to worry about that. They handle it internally. Because if you switch from LinkedIn to Google, the way the request is done, even if it's similar, the protocol, the parameters and the names and the convention is different. So it handles that for you. While Oauth Live, you will need to go more into the code. It's more on the backend side and so on. And Oauth Live is the one that also it implements the protocol, but they also implement the identity provider. So you can have identity provider directly if you want other applications access your user database. Sometimes you want to create your own database of users, so you can use Oauth Live better.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jorge.